Welcome back. We now have Dylan J from PretaGov, who's going to offer us some actual data on whether FOSS is losing ground to SaaS. Thank you, Dylan. Take it away.
Okay, thank you everyone for coming. So who am I? Other than my name, I'm the CTO of PretaGov. We are a software house, digital consultancy. We've been around for over 18 years. We do web, we do AI, we do search. We work in a bunch of different markets, particularly Australia and UK, and some in Thailand. Some people who are local may know me from, I bootstrapped the PyCons here, and I run the local Python user group. So what this talk is not about is actually, there's been some excellent talks all about things like, the restricted open source licenses and how SaaS is not contributing. So if you're expecting that kind of talk, go back and watch some of the others. It's not about that. It's going to be more about this particular market. It's going to be a lot about developer experience, DX, user experience, and why some people pick some software over others. What is a CMS? So a lot of people will know WordPress, but I'm going to talk about what the process is of how a website mostly gets built these days. So you'll have a client, say. The client will, in most cases, go to some kind of digital agency. It might be internal development team, but the process is roughly the same. And the first thing they'll probably talk about is design and requirements and integrations and so on. Come up with some kind of design or design system. Then that will give given to a specialist CMS developer, and that CMS developer will have a tool in their back pocket, which will be their favorite CMS that they know inside out. So WordPress would be the most popular. Then what they do is they take that CMS and they customize it. It becomes a kind of conjoined thing. It becomes a version of WordPress for that particular customer in a way. Then you'll have an editor who will then supply the words and the content, and that becomes the final website that you see. It gets maintained over time, and that maintenance process is upgrading and reintegrating and changing the theme and putting security patches and so on. I'm going to talk about some other ways that CMS works, but this is like the most common way that it works now.
Guys, can we have a little less background? Thanks very much.
So last year we did this machine learning project, and what we did was we scraped about 9,000 websites information, the history of those websites from a UK government register. So take, for example, Raspberry Pi Foundation's one that people might know, which is a non-profit registered in the UK. And we managed to get history like this, which said, like, here's they were 2 years on Contentful, there was 7 years on WordPress. This is the history of their entire website in one line. We got some extra information about style changes and so on. In the register, there's information about their last year's income, which is surprisingly a lot. We also scraped information on how big the website was, like how many pages are in the website. And we used that information to come up with a prediction on if in 6 to 12 months they will change their technology. And for this particular example, 86%. So if anyone is here next year, and I happen to be here next year, and they have or have not changed their website, it'll be interesting to find out. So come this year, we're in the process of we've done a sort of proof of concept for our own headless CMS. And we were kind of interested in this idea of like, well, there's all this hype, there's all this stuff put out by mostly SaaS vendors for headless CMS, saying that headless CMS is the future and everyone is adopting it and so on. And it's like, how do you see through that hype? So this is an example of one particular group that did some research. And there's lots and lots of examples of that on the web. So if only there was an accurate data set, and I realized, okay, we do have kind of this data set. So I put it together and I came up with this graph here. So I'm going to explain a little bit the meaning of these different groupings. There are other data sets out there. There's W3C text and built with and stuff, but they don't categorize the different styles of CMS, and they also don't go back nearly as far in history as this. So the very first thing you'll notice is that headless CMS is a lot smaller than the hype would have you believe, but it is growing. And then the next thing I really realized is, well, open source is going down, which is super interesting. And it's kind of getting, the only things that are growing here are these site builders and headless CMS. And that's what I want to talk about. So let's understand a little bit more about these categories, right? So offline CMS is basically Dreamweaver front page. That's all the stuff of how the web used to be built, 15 years ago, as you can see in that graph. And this is what the top 10 looks like there. And it doesn't really exist today. So open source CMS, now, when I'm defining open source CMS, what I'm talking about is that deployment model that I talked before. It's where the code gets deployed separately. It's not a SaaS service. It is that monolith, what's called in the headless world, monolithic architecture. It gets combined together. So WordPress is probably the best example. And this is the top 10 for, at least for this particular market, right? This is UK non-profits. And as you can see, it is going down overall, but and pretty much everyone except for WordPress and Umbraco, which is interesting. I think because Umbraco is like one of the only games in town for .NET open source CMS. So licensed CMS is really the same architecture. It's not any different. It's just that you have to pay for a license. It's not open source. So things like SharePoint and, well, there's the example, right? So Expression Engine, which is now open source, but wasn't for most of its lifetime. And again, all of that's going down, interestingly, except for Craft CMS, which is an interesting point. I think, I'm not entirely sure why Craft CMS is kind of going up. I think from understanding, talking to people who use it, I think it's very, very developer friendly. It gets out of the way of the presentation layer, and that's why it's particularly popular. Also, it has a very cheap license. So, site builders. Site builders, I think, people would know things like Squarespace and Wix. And the difference there is you're probably talking about smaller organizations. You go online, you do the design or pick the design yourself and customize it. So you as an organization are both the designer and the editor and the person who procures it. So I have included things like WordPress.com, which is basically the SaaS version. And this is quite interesting with regard to like this particular market, because not only do you have the obvious ones like Squarespace and Wix, but there's a lot of verticals in there, right? There are like Tiers, I think, is a school one. There's a charity one. There's a lot of church-only ones. There's these very verticals, and that's something that is kind of coming into that market. And if you're a church, you don't want to pay a lot, and you'll find having it look like other church websites and have got a bunch of extra added functionality that's specific to that market. So headless CMS. So headless CMS, I think, is really categorized by the fact that the developers have more freedom. The presentation layer is separated. Sorry. Okay, so you have the client, you have the designer, you have the design, but then that'll be given to a front-end developer, which is a different kind of developer, maybe less specialized because they know a bunch of different front-end technologies, not just the CMS. And they will build this front-end, say Next.js or something. But that is a separate deployment and has a separate life cycle from the CMS part. And that may be SaaS. A lot of headless CMS is SaaS. It can be open source, like Strappy or headless WordPress or something like that. But either way, the upgrade cycle of how those go forward is different. You can upgrade the CMS part separately, and you don't have to rebuild the front end for that. The content editors will be interfacing with the CMS part, not with the front end. Now, if it is open source, you can get a developer to go and customize the admin UI. If you want to add extra functionality, often you'll use a microservice, another deployment that'll be separate. And all of this is like, okay, it looks more complicated, right? You've got more boxes sitting there. It looks like it's worse. But this is from a very good book. If you want to, I thoroughly recommend this book. It's The Law of Divergence. And basically it's saying that all technology gets better by separating to separate things. Like combos don't really work. So this is showing my age here a little bit, but the combination VHS, DVD, TV did not last very long. The flying car doesn't exist because you're just going to have a worse car and a worse plane, right? And if one part breaks, then you've got an even worse car, right? A very expensive car, maybe. So the headless market, again, it is a very small part of the segment, but it is rapidly growing. And you can kind of see that, especially in that last 5-year period, that's changed quite a bit, right? It's kind of slow uptake, and then it's really taken off recently. So I did kind of neglect part of that. When I was talking about the CMS market, what I'm talking about is the detected CMSs. There is this other line, see this orange line here, which is this unknowns. So that's things that I could not detect. And that is mostly going to be custom sites, or it's going to be small agencies with their own CMS that they only do for them. In there will be maybe undetected CMSs that I couldn't work out how to detect, and possibly actually headless CMSs themselves are quite hard to detect sometimes. So that's possibly a little bit unrepresented. So that's what I kind of said there. One interesting question is okay, is it representative of the web in general, right? So if you look at W3C Text, that's what it says is the market share at the moment. This is what I say is the market share at the moment. It's not too different. Interesting, Drupal is a little bit higher than the general web. Maybe that's because it's a bit more of a content-centric market. I mean, there are differences. There's going to be less e-commerce. There's going to be less Shopify than the normal web. But it's also better in some ways as a sample because there's no spam sites, right? It's coming from a government register. There's one website per organization. So it kind of is maybe a better representation in some ways. There's probably more of those vertical site builders than the general web. This is just if you're interested in how it was done and what we included and what we didn't include. So what's the conclusions from all this? My hot takes on this, my personal opinion. So again, like I said, the blue line, the site builders, definitely taking a chunk out of the market, right? The only other one going up is the headless CMS. So my idea of why this is happening, I think, is that you have. So if we look at this axis here, right? So we've got the more custom sites, the bigger budget, where branding matters, and more content on one end. And then we have down the other end, the kind of lower budget, less custom sites. And then we've got this sort of, good developer experience at the bottom, less hassle versus worse for the developers and ops and so on at the bottom. So the monolithic architecture, the open source and the licensed CMS, it covers a broad range. It can go up to very customized, down, particularly with some of the site builder stuff on the open source, down to quite simple sites. But it comes at a cost. It's a reasonable amount of work to maintain. It's a reasonable amount of work to set up. Whereas you've got the site builders coming in at the sort of lower end, but it's much less hassle. In fact, the best kind of developer experience is no developer at all, which is what a site builder is. So that's very easy to get going. And then headless CMS is more work, but it gives the developers more freedom. And maintenance-wise, ongoing ops, it is less hassle. And that's sort of taking that custom space, I think. And I think AI is going to accelerate this stuff. So AI is going to make the site builders more custom, and AI is going to make the headless CMS easier to build, quicker to build. So this is one particular quote from a client who went from a open source CMS to a headless CMS, and why they did. And it's just because they didn't want to have to deal with the updates and hosting it themselves and all that stuff. But that's anecdotal. You can go back to data and see that the data shows the same thing. So this axis along the bottom, this is percentile of income. It's no longer time. So top 20% up there, you can see that headless in the top 20% of the sites with a higher income in the last year, and that's kind of a proxy for how much money they might care about branding, how much money they might spend. So you can see that licensed definitely goes up with the income goes up. They're willing to spend a bit more money. Open source stays the same, but the site builder, kind of the blue line, that goes down. And really, it's only at the top end, which is interesting. Maybe they're early adopters. They're picking up the headless CMS. But if we take the page count, right, the size of the site, there you can see it more dramatically, right? Perhaps because the size of the site means that you need better content management features, UX, and that's more mature in I think, the open source CMS at the moment. So that goes up as the page count goes up. The headless CMS definitely goes up, and the site builder kind of goes down. So it's kind of showing that this is the case. So to answer the original question, is open source losing to SaaS? Yes, definitely not at the moment, but over time it will be, except for WordPress. But WordPress, I think, if you look at that graph, it's not flatlining yet, but the growth is definitely slowed. It's starting to lose ground, I think. And I think, so I think the fact that WordPress is no longer growing to the same extent is perhaps one explanation you see for the arguments around the controversy around WordPress at the moment. Like, it's a VC-backed company, they need to grow, they're no longer growing, so they're starting to attack its own community, and maybe that's one explanation of what's going on there. And definitely licensed CMS is a kind of a dead end. But one thing I didn't really touch on is that open source definitely has a niche. It has a very important role in this. It's never going to disappear. You have issues like data sovereignty, where you don't want to put it on a SaaS service, high security, things like intranets, again, where you worry about where the data is, where you need to customize that editing experience, which you can't do with, say, a headless CMS or like a SaaS headless CMS or a site builder. But I think that going forward, the headless market for open source, which I included within the headless, included both open source and SaaS, is going to grow more. UX, I think, matters too. Like, I've talked a lot about developer experience. I think the things of how a CMS is chosen. So actually, I was going to reverse this. So these top two, I think, maybe the organization preferences, things like cost and security and their tech stack, that's probably the number one reason why a CMS gets chosen. Then probably developer preference, particularly, they may not care. They may just go and like, okay, who's cheapest? And then an agency has their preferred CMS, and that's what they end up with. And that's been my experience. And user experience, like the editing experience, actually comes down much lower in the stack, in the hierarchy of preferences. But it's a differentiator, right? If I'm an agency, I want to sell a CMS that's going to be easy to use, that people aren't going to come back to me and say, why can't I do this? Why can't I do that? So it is really important from that point of view. And generally, like, I think the thing with open source is that it doesn't always make good user interfaces, and that's because of the scratch your own itch, right? Because developers, when they in order to scratch your own itch, you have to be a developer. Therefore, you only understand developer needs. You don't understand, not many people that I know who build CMSs actually edit using CMSs. And so they're actually not that good at understanding an editor's problems. And for this reason, I think that, SaaS, single companies that have designers that can be kind of forced on developers tend to make better UX. And community open source is not as good as it should be. And headless CMS actually has its own issues with usability, because it wasn't so obvious, but you don't have as much of a kind of a WYSIWYG interface. You often get these forms and so on. It's kind of, because it's decoupled, what you edit and what you see is not the same thing. And that's one problem we're trying to solve with our CMS. And that's it. Any questions?
Cool. Just before we do, is Kim Bros in the room? Looking for Kim Bros? No Kim Bros. All right. Oh, there you go. Could you please sort out your slides? No rush. We've got 12 minutes, so, but just... Okay, so, questions for Dylan? You have covered the topic so completely, there is nothing left to ask. I thought that was interesting. I think I'd sort of taken for granted that the sort of relentless march of SaaS would mean that those curves would tend to look one way. And so I'm surprised they're actually not as pronounced as perhaps I had expected.
I think one thing about this market is that it's a slow-moving market, right? You can't just go and replace that piece of software that quickly, right? It's especially if you're talking about you've got the agency knowledge, the developer knowledge on how to build the site. That changes quickly, slowly, and then organizations on average is about 5-6 years when they change technologies. There's that kind of lag that's in there.
It's not like buying a sandwich. There's a deep knowledge at both ends. Ah. Oh, thank you.
One thing that's interesting is the switchover of technology with headless CMS is faster. It's easier to switch out, which is something I noticed in the data.
I was just curious, you've got a line for open source and a different line for headless, but headless might be open source as well.
Yeah, I combine them together. I mean, it's a small kind of market, and in actual fact, I didn't touch on this, but it's actually even harder to detect open source, self-hosted headless CMS than it is to detect the SaaS ones are easy because they point to a very contentful URL. But if it's say Strappy or something like that, it's actually reasonably hard with the way I'm detecting it, where I'm scraping like a single page and not running JavaScript and so on to actually work it out. So I do know of like examples of Strappy sites and WordPress sites that are headless that aren't detected in there. At the same time, I was a little more liberal. I was like anything that was Next.js or Nux.js, I assumed it was headless. So yeah, so I didn't separate those two. I could separate those two, but it would make it even smaller. So when I'm talking about headless on open source on that graph, take it as meaning monolithic architecture open source.
Hi, Dylan. You mentioned the fact that WordPress is VC-backed, is going to contribute to its kind of plateauing. But WordPress is ostensibly split up into WordPress.org and then the for-profit WordPress.com. So how do you reconcile? Are you saying that both are VC-backed essentially?
So I was particularly talking about what is it, Matt Mullenberg or whatever his name is, like his sort of comments and stuff, and maybe that's a little bit why there's this frustration and tension there. Like why they're going, okay, so there's people breathing down his back maybe, and they're asking a question about where's the growth going to come from now, and then you look at WordPress, WP Engine or whatever it is, and you go, they're taking our money. So I wasn't talking about the growth of WordPress with regard to that. I was just saying the controversy is maybe because the growth is slowing.
Okay, noted. Thanks.
Right. Once the rate of cash injections stops climbing, then everyone switches to optimizing. Yeah. At which point? Yeah. Okay.
I think it was the Basecamp guys, the Ruby guys, who said like VC is like having a time bomb strapped to your back. It's like if you stop growing or whatever, then it's going to blow up, right? It's a real problem if you take VC money. So. Okay, any other questions, or if anyone's interested in getting work done by us, let us know. Thank you very much.
Thank you.